Hello, everyone, and welcome to this broadcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm a journalist and an editor of the Dissenter newsletter that's down there on the screen, thedissenter.org, where you can find updates on WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's case. We got some news. You'll be hearing from me about the thing that I always have something to say about. I've been covering this case extensively for over 10 years following this, following what's happening. We see all this chatter. We've heard all of this chatter about President Joe Biden considering Julian Assange's case. And what that was taken to mean is that potentially there could be a dropping of the charges, a plea deal, because there's been requests from Australia, because Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. And it was a possibility, I suppose, though I never really took it that seriously, that when these assurances, as we're going to get to, were supposed to be submitted to the British Appeals Court, the UK High Court of Justice, that they could decide not to. They could decide that they would seek a way to end this finally. They wouldn't go forward with defending the extradition request any longer because Julian Assange has been in prison for 5 years. He's been in the Belmarsh maximum security prison in London for 5 years. That's not the choice that they made. So welcome. I'm the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. And right down there is the URL, the address for the Dissenter newsletter. And I'd like to say before I get going that if you're inclined to support the work that I do, the independent journalism that I do on whistleblowers, on WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, press freedom, more broadly, government secrecy, then go to this. Do not give your money to Google. Don't give your money to Google. If you want to support journalism, give your money to this, or, I don't have to be the only journalist who you support. But if you're supporting independent media, know that your donations are going through Google, and I will see only a very small percentage of it. So if you're inclined to support this work, that's where I suggest that you go. That being said, I recommend that you follow the latest developments here with me by loading or seeing the article that I posted at the Dissenter. Over at the Dissenter, I have written about the breaking news that we have that has just been the submission that was the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in London, submitted these assurances that we'll get to. These are promises. These are pledges. They often have loopholes in them. The last iteration, the last round of assurances that were submitted had to do with how Julian Assange would be treated in U.S. custody, either in detention or in a U.S. prison. So we're highly skeptical of these assurances that have been put forward. They come from the U.S. State Department. They come from diplomats. They were in a diplomatic note. The Crown Prosecution Service had them. They are shared with the court, and the High Court of Justice will look at them, and there will be a hearing on May 20th where these assurances are argued over. Certainly Julian Assange's legal team, they're highly skeptical of these assurances, and we'll get to those reasons right now. So let me just pull this up here, though, so you can see what I'm looking at. If you would like to follow along in any way, or maybe it's easier for you to just go read this article yourself instead of listening to me, you can go to U.S. government rejects Australia's call to end Assange case, submits assurances for extradition. I'll be getting into some other issues. I'd also like to play a clip of the ghoul who is the spokes for the State Department, Matthew Miller. I'd like to play a clip of him speaking about the Assange case, because to me, I think that was really when you could have been tipped off to the fact that this was not going to end. All this discussion about the end of this case against Julian Assange, I think it was possible to understand when Matthew Miller was just several days ago, last week, defended the prosecution once again. It's something the State Department has done before, but in defending the prosecution against Julian Assange, right after it was in the news that Joe Biden was considering an end to the case, like a plea deal, it was obvious that that was what was happening. What was happening is the State Department would keep pushing onward, trying to help bring Julian Assange to the United States for an unprecedented trial. To be clear, if you don't know, the charges that are laid out against him, these allegations all involve standard news gathering activities. All of the documents that were published in 2010 and 2011 from Chelsea Manning, U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, that is the subject of this prosecution. It involves U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. diplomacy, exposing the kinds of conduct that diplomats at the U.S. State Department have an interest in prosecuting Julian Assange because WikiLeaks happened to them. So no wonder they're helping to bring Julian Assange to trial. And then you had Guantanamo files that were exposed on all of the detainees. We get to see the false intelligence that were keeping people indefinitely detained, much like Julian Assange is in his own kind of indefinite detention right now at the Belmarsh maximum security prison. And so all of these files, and of course there was the collateral murder video, but they didn't charge him for that. They didn't charge him for that video. They just charged him with the rules of engagement files that go with the video. They don't want the video to be played in a courtroom. So they know that if that was played before a jury and they got to see a war crime play out before their eyes, that it might make Julian Assange sympathetic as a publisher. So they kept that out of the indictment against Julian Assange. And so let's go back to here. These assurances. What happened is there was a hearing where Julian Assange sought permission to appeal. And in asking to appeal in February, that hearing where all of these grounds for appeal, they presented their arguments. They asked the High Court of Justice. The High Court of Justice comes back in March, and in March they say, okay, there are about 2.5 of these grounds for appeal that we think are valid. And we think that the risk that he might be exposed to the death penalty is certainly troubling. And then we think that the fact that he might be exposed to a violation of his rights because the First Amendment will not be extended to protect him, that's a problem as well. And so what happens now is that the U.S. government has responded with these assurances that they were asked to provide to basically avoid an appeal hearing. Julian Assange will not have an appeal before this High Court of Justice, not have a shot at stopping this extradition before the High Court if the High Court of Justice believes that these assurances are good enough to prevent any kind of a hearing. And so on May 20th, as I said earlier, we will hear these arguments. There will be arguments I won't get to because I'm in the United States. And even though I have a stake in this, the court has made a decision that journalists from around the world have to physically get to the jurisdiction of England or Wales so we can be punished if we don't follow the court's rules. And so that, they can force us to abide by a set of guidelines that are being imposed on media. And so, you got the option. There's probably a day-long hearing that will take place, and you go. So we'll be relying on the British journalists, the British media, who've been, I guess, so on this. There will be certain people who have covered this regularly, who I imagine will hop on a plane and schlep on over to London and cover it. I have a reporter colleague, Mohammed Almazi, that will likely be helping the dissenter cover this once again in London. I have to reach out to him and ask, but that will be the way that we follow these proceedings through the people in the courtroom. There's limited media space. There's also, the conditions are not great for covering it. There were acoustical issues last time. People couldn't hear people speaking in the courtroom, even though they were not that far away. But That being said, we'll try to follow these arguments that will happen around the death penalty, around the First Amendment. So let me read to you exactly what was written in this diplomatic note. And these are the assurances. There's basically two assurances here. The first one is that Assange will not be prejudiced by reason of nationality with respect to which defenses he may seek to raise at trial and at sentencing. Specifically, if extradited, Assange will have the ability to raise and seek to rely upon at trial, and then there's a parentheses, it says, which includes any sentencing hearing. So I'll go back and read this again. Specifically, if extradited, Assange will have the ability to raise and seek to rely upon at trial the rights and protections given under the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. The U.S. Embassy then continued to say, a decision as to the applicability of the First Amendment is exclusively within the purview of the U.S. courts. All right, so that is the First Amendment assurance. And on its face, it seems good. It seems good because we know that they will be able to, if you're Julian Assange, you will be able to make a First Amendment challenge to the Espionage Act. But that was never in doubt. There was never any doubt that Julian Assange, if he's on trial, could go before the court and challenge the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. It's happened before. We've had people who are whistleblowers attempt to have their charges dismissed on the grounds that it infringes upon their First Amendment rights. They've made constitutional challenges to the Espionage Act. They've said it's vague and overbroad. They've challenged it on the condition that it's selectively applied to people, which is true. Those who are lower level get prosecuted. Primarily those in high-ranking positions are spared from prosecution, even though they violate the law. And so it was never in doubt that Julian Assange could go before this court and make a First Amendment challenge. The issue is, does he have First Amendment rights? Now, he's a foreign national. He's a foreign national, but he also is a foreign national who does not have ties to the United States. So he hasn't spent any significant, he hasn't been in the United States for any period of time. He's never lived here. He's never really been part of any organization based in the United States. And so what this means is that the U.S. is saying, without really getting to the core of the concern, that Julian Assange can make a First Amendment challenge. He can come before the court and say that he has First Amendment rights. But, we're not really going to tell the court whether we think that Julian Assange, as a foreign national, has First Amendment rights. We're not really going to address that. But of course, we are not going to prejudice him. Like any other person we would extradite to the United States, their attorneys will have the same ability to challenge the charges against them. But that was never the question. So this assurance will definitely be argued before the High Court, and I will get to more of why this is an issue that was pinpointed by the High Court. What they said. This is really significant, that the High Court understood what the U.S. government was doing. They said that Julian Assange wants to argue that if he is granted First Amendment rights, then the prosecution would be stopped. And that is the argument. The argument is that journalists are protected under the First Amendment to publish classified government documents, that it is a part of regular and routine journalistic activities. And so the High Court stated that the First Amendment is therefore of central importance to his defense to the extradition charge. And further, if he is convicted, he may wish to invoke the First Amendment on the question of sentence. If he is not permitted to rely on the First Amendment because of his status as a foreign national, he will thereby be prejudiced, potentially very greatly prejudiced, by reason of his nationality. And this didn't come out of nowhere. The lead prosecutor in this case, his name is Assistant U.S. Attorney Gordon Kromberg. Yes, you may hiss if you hear his name. He is an Islamophobe. He is somebody who is quite zealous. He was involved in prosecuting drone whistleblower Daniel Hale. These people that he went after Samuel Arian. If you know anything, you follow Palestine. You're tuned into Palestinian human rights issues. You're tuned into civil liberties cases involving Palestinian dissenters in the United States. You might know a little bit about that. So, Assistant U.S. Attorney Gordon Kromberg, he said that the U.S. government could argue at trial that Assange is not protected by the First Amendment. And he made a formal sworn declaration on behalf of the U.S. government and in support of the extradition request. Kromberg put himself forward as able to provide authoritative assistance as to the application of the First Amendment. This is the High Court. I'm quoting from the High Court of Justice. They say, it can fairly be assumed that he would not have said, that's Kromberg, he would not have said that the prosecution could argue that foreign nationals are not entitled to protections under the First Amendment unless that was a tenable argument that the prosecution was entitled to deploy with a real prospect of success. If such an argument were to succeed, it would at least arguably cause the applicant prejudice on the grounds of his non-U.S. citizenship and hence on the grounds of his nationality. So not having First Amendment rights makes it possible for the U.S. government to more easily deprive Julian Assange of the sort of fairness that should exist in these proceedings. I think that's what the High Court is saying. They're saying that if he was a U.S. citizen, he would be able to manage and defend himself against this Espionage Act prosecution much better than he can now because he is a foreign national. So if you extend First Amendment rights to Julian Assange, we will believe that he will not be prejudiced. They're not, in their assurances, they're not saying that the prosecution won't enter a courtroom and seek to deny Julian Assange First Amendment rights. All they're saying is that he can make a First Amendment challenge. But that, as I can repeatedly say throughout this broadcast, is not the problem. So the other aspect here is that Julian Assange might be exposed to the death penalty. That was something that came up in the hearing where the grounds for appeal were presented. The High Court saw that there was some reason to believe that this could be so. And there was discussion of the matter, and this is what the U.S. government came up with as an assurance. The assurance is that a sentence of death will neither be sought nor imposed on Assange. The United States is able to provide such assurance as Assange is not charged with a death penalty eligible offense. And the United States assures that he will not be tried for a death eligible offense. That's basic. I think, could we be relieved? Could we be happy that Julian Assange isn't going to be executed, that he's not going to be put on death row? They're right. The Espionage Act offenses do not carry the death penalty as something that can be handed down. People who are accused of violating the Espionage Act, you could stack them. You could have people serve 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, but the maximum for an Espionage Act offense is 10 years in prison. Then you have the computer crime offense. That's a 5-year offense typically. I think there might be ways for that to be longer. They could impose a terrorism enhancement at the sentencing if they might try to go after that. But there's no death penalty. That's not available to the U.S. prosecutors. However, the assurance doesn't address the more glaring concern that was put before the High Court of Justice. And that was the possibility that if Julian Assange is extradited to the United States, charges might be tacked on to the indictment. And you might have a charge of aiding and abetting treason, or you might have a charge of espionage, classic espionage, like spying for a foreign power, say Russia or China or some other adversary of the United States. So if they would choose to do that, then those are crimes that carry capital offenses, like the capital punishment is available. could be have the death penalty imposed if you are accused of espionage. They would, they could formally take that off the table. In an assurance, they could have said, well, these are the crimes that we intend to charge Julian Assange with. We're not going to be seeking additional charges when he arrives in the United States. Just make it clear. Just restate it. I think that there's some kind of presumption through the agreement that they have between the United States and the UK that when you bring people over, you're not going to add additional charges, but it can change. There isn't anything binding. And if they have some reason to add charges, it hasn't been proven or demonstrated to me that they are barred from doing so if they want to. And if there's political pressure, if an administration wants to go further, a Democrat or a Republican, let's just be clear. Right now, there is uncharged conduct that is not in the indictment. He hasn't been charged for publishing Vault 7 materials from the CIA about offensive cyber hacking capabilities, the thing that made Mike Pompeo so angry that they went after and targeted Julian Assange. There isn't anything in the indictment about the publication of the Clinton campaign emails or the DNC emails. This is the thing that the Democrats keep going on and on and on about, blaming him for Donald Trump and saying that he cost Hillary Clinton the election and was working on behalf of Russia. So if that is part of the understanding of Assange's conduct over the last 10 to 15 years, do we really believe that it won't worm its way into this prosecution somehow? Right now it's very confined to 2010, 2011, and then there's some general allegations. It extends a little bit past WikiLeaks providing source protection to Edward Snowden as he was trying to get to safety, flee from Hong Kong. Of course, he got stuck in a Moscow airport, stayed there with Sarah Harrison, who is an unindicted co-conspirator in this case, by the way. And so they have other conduct that they can bring into this. And so we know that this assurance is one that will be argued over. It'll be argued over just as much as the First Amendment assurances. Both of these assurances, they'll have their own hearing. This is what it will be about. It'll be very tight, very confined to these smaller issues. And obviously, the larger thing is still, why do we have these charges? Why do we have this case? All around the world, freedom of the press organizations, you have civil liberties or human rights organizations, you have parliamentarians in different European countries. The German, I believe the chancellor, he said that he thought this should end. You have people in Latin American countries, leaders. Obrador, the president of Mexico, continues to raise Julian Assange and say that this is a political prisoner who should be freed. Lula, you have Lula in Brazil, all around the world. And then Australia's pressure. They are a client state. I'm not going to sit here and say that they aren't doing what the United States wants when it comes to countering China. They're playing a role. They're one of the Five Eyes. They are a country that prizes its military and intelligence relationship with the United States government. With that being said, they have made an issue out of this politically, their people, and through their campaigning on behalf of one of their citizens, Julian Assange. They have turned this into something where people are engaged and are pressuring their government to bring one of their citizens back home. And that has resulted in Anthony Albanese, the prime minister, saying, it would appear straight up to Joe Biden, that what we mean by that is make a plea agreement, make a deal, allow him to be freed. And now they're saying have him plead guilty to a felony. And I don't think Julian Assange is willing to do that. So I say that, the Biden administration defies Australia's call to end the Assange case in the headline of this video. I recognize that the way that Australia is willing to end the case is probably not satisfactory to Julian Assange. He does not want to set a precedent that will jeopardize journalism globally. And that is a very honorable and principled stance. And in the negotiations around a plea, it's finding a way that the U.S. can feel that they have held Julian Assange responsible for conduct that they see as criminal, but also make sure that it isn't a precedent that could be used against Julian Assange. Against other journalists. Yeah. So that's where we are. I want to play the clip of the U.S. State Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller, that was from last week. So I'm just going to take a moment here to pull that up. And now I'm going to also look over here. I have some comments. People are engaging with the video. I thank you all for stopping by to join in. Thank you, Pat, for the donation. Again, I would just say that my preference is, because that goes through Google and Google's going to take a cut of that donation, my preference is that if you are inclined to donate, that you go to dissenter.org/donate. Everything that you give goes right to funding journalism on Julian Assange, whistleblowers, press freedom. And I don't have to wait for YouTube to give me whatever small percent I'm going to be entitled to receiving. So let me get this up here. And, this is, I think, the clearest indication that, considering that was an offhand remark from Joe Biden, he was just placating the people who have been raising this. He knows that there's a group out there that wants to see Julian Assange freed. It's the same thing of, like, he knows there's a group of people who want a ceasefire around Gaza. He knows how to Democrats know how to placate people. They think that if they can form the words in the right way, that then they will just pause. They'll think, like, okay, maybe the door is open. It's possible. We're going to get what we want. And then later on, they do the exact opposite of what they seem to be hinting at doing. And so, the same way we don't have a ceasefire in Gaza, they abstain, and you think that that means that now the United Nations will be able to enforce some kind of a ceasefire and help the people of Gaza. Yeah, well, no, because the U.S. isn't going to recognize that vote. They're not going to recognize it. The same thing here is just like, okay, we're considering plea negotiations. Okay, well, what does that even mean? Like, it's no more than saying that you have concerns about human rights violations. You're not doing anything to stop that action from continuing. So let's pull this up here. I need to switch over to this. I have this clip over here that involves Ryan Grimm of The Intercept questioning Matthew Miller. And then we'll get to a bit about Matthew Miller and his history with Assange before I conclude.
But now that the president
asked, I'm going to cue this up, and I'm going to get out of the way here and play this. All right. Here we go.
Right. President Biden said this week that the U.S. is considering Australia's request that it drop its extradition attempt against Julian Assange and instead allow him to go back to Australia. Normally, when we ask about Assange, you say, refer you to the Department of Justice. But now that the president has said that there are diplomatic talks going on, that seems like it would be squarely in the State Department. So is the State Department involved in these conversations with Australia? And what can you tell us about these talks?
That is a good way to try to get me to violate that rule about not commenting on extradition matters. But I'm going to refrain from doing so. I don't have any comment. I would refer to the Justice Department for comment.
Does it broadly raise concerns for you about free speech and free press issues? You often will see dictators say, why is the U.S. lecturing us about press freedoms when they're trying to extradite a foreign citizen to their own maximum security prison?
So I will let the Justice Department largely speak to this issue. But as you've heard me say here before, one of the crimes that Julian Assange is charged with is helping Chelsea Manning hack into government systems, not receiving classified information, but helping her actually break into government systems to retrieve classified information, which, as far as I'm aware, has never been considered a legitimate journalistic practice, and is not the kind of practice that journalistic organizations typically engage in.
Well, technically, he offered to help her cloak her identity so that she wouldn't be discovered. We as journalists do that all the time with sources talking on Signal and other devices to try to make sure that sources are protected. Is that considered helping?
So I am now a little bit, but probably further than I ought to go, about facts that still are contained, or alleged facts that are contained in a pending indictment.
They're not even facts. It's not even a fact. And he got caught. Ryan Grimm smelled exactly the bullshit that he was trying to spread about Julian Assange and the allegations against him. And then when caught, as he's known to do, he acted like he had now violated some kind of cardinal rule as a spokesperson for the State Department. This is what happens, when you're paid to lie, and then your lies are easy to sniff out. You start to get uncomfortable, and then you go to the next question, and then you don't have to deal with the fact that what you said is just pure bullshit. It's that simple. He got caught, and people can see as you watch it. There's no breaking into the systems of the Pentagon. There is no breaking into military computers that happened with Julian Assange's assistance. Chelsea Manning, as I've said before, as many others have covered, and as people understand, Chelsea Manning had access to these files. She doesn't need to go through the systems anonymously. There wasn't any reason why she needed to hide that she was downloading files on U.S. wars, or downloading those embassy cables, or downloading the Guantanamo files. Any of these files, she could have argued, were documents that were worth researching and understanding through her work in intelligence as an all-source military analyst, as an all-source military intelligence analyst who was deployed in Baghdad. And all of this information that she was looking through, she might have been combing through information that would be useful to her work capturing people in Iraq. And so, yes, at some point she veered away from it and provided the material to WikiLeaks. And then that was when she ran afoul of the laws that are imposed on U.S. government employees and U.S. military officers. But just to be clear, she did not need any help. And so everything that Matthew Miller is saying is wrong. But there's other reasons why we should object to Matthew Miller. But I do just want to point out here that the State Department is the one part of the U.S. government that, when asked about Julian Assange, defends the charges. So the Justice Department doesn't comment on the case, doesn't speak to any of the issues raised by press freedom organizations. The White House, when asked about this, doesn't either. Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about this along with the Press Act. It was last week or 10 days ago. She was asked about it, and they say no comment. Typically, they do not address any of the things that are raised as issues related to the case. And so the State Department is out there distinguishing itself, and they'll do it during World Press Freedom Week. They'll do it around International Human Rights Day. They'll do it while at the same time attacking certain countries, speaking openly about how journalism is not a crime. They will say what they really think, and that is that no matter how many different countries take issue with this prosecution, they want Julian Assange's head on a pike. They want him to be prosecuted. They want him in. They will not be satisfied until Julian Assange has served some amount of time in a U.S. prison cell. That's what they would like. And There is no end for him that they see as appropriate. Like, they're not willing to accept that being in Belmarsh prison for 5 years could be enough punishment. They're so thirsty for vengeance, just as the CIA is likely, just foaming at the mouth for Julian Assange to be brought to the U.S. for a trial. And so that is why they continue to speak like this. And so even Matthew Miller gets caught. Even Matthew Miller, who has already become, the biggest booster of Israeli genocide. It's a genocidal assault on Palestinians. Even Matthew Miller gets caught because in the past, so here, as I can point out, back in 2013, Matthew Miller was the person who said the problem that the DOJ has always had in investigating Julian Assange is there is no way to prosecute him for publishing information without the same theory being applied to journalists. That's what he said. He gave that comment to the Washington Post. The Washington Post had an article about how the Obama Justice Department was not going to indict Julian Assange. This is what he said. He understood it. There, when the law was being applied the way that it's supposed to, and not political considerations, he understood that if they were going to charge Julian Assange, they would be posing a danger to press freedom. And they had all the information available. That's what I want you to recognize. This thing that he's saying about Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, that is wrong. That's not a fact. You can say that however much he wants. It's not a fact. But this thing he's saying about the computer crime, that was available to the Justice Department then. They could have. They didn't. They could have charged Julian Assange with a computer crime and then no Espionage Act offenses. They never did. Now, they might say, well, he was a fugitive. They like to say that. They say he's a fugitive because he was in the Ecuador embassy in London. But that hasn't stopped people before from being charged. I mean, look at these Russiagate cases, the people who were indicted. None of them are anywhere where they could be arrested and put on trial in the United States. They still get their names entered into court as defendants and they're indicted. And if they ever were in some place and a jurisdiction where U.S. authorities can get to them, they'd be picked up. That's the point. The point is to now limit the freedom of movement of those people. They could do that to Julian Assange. They could have, which is to say, they could have indicted Julian Assange and made it even more impossible for him to step out of the Ecuador embassy in London and then get to a Latin American country. He was trying to go to a Latin American country to live under asylum. Matthew Miller also, this is remarkable. He was opposed to this prosecution before he was for it. All right. So here's Julian Assange's brother. And let me just make this a little bigger here. Back in 2019, here he is, and he's saying that the prosecution of Julian Assange would be dangerous and unconstitutional. Okay, so here, let's get the rest of this. The rest of this is that it would be dangerous and probably unconstitutional. DOJ doesn't get to decide who is deserving of First Amendment protections and who isn't. There's a reason we wouldn't charge this in the Obama administration. What was I saying? That the Justice Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller, was against it. But now he's an all-out ghoul for the State Department. He's this guy who has abandoned all principles of human rights. If he's for genocide, how is he going to go out there and support freedom of the press for people who the national security state despises? The answer is obvious. And so you raise a good question. Am I saying that the State Department is the thirstiest for revenge on Assange? I don't think so, but I think that the State Department is willing to join and lock arms with the CIA in an effort to make sure that Julian Assange is brought to trial. I think that there are people who are there who believe what was done to them when those cables were published is wrong, and that they are in favor of putting Assange on trial. And this trial would be one. We've already seen an unprecedented attack on journalism. It's already sent a message, and it's already made life more difficult for journalists around the world. There's already countries that look at this and I think undoubtedly are emboldened. World Press Freedom Day is coming up in the first week of May, and you think about it, we'll all think about the state of press freedom around the world. And the US government will talk about Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, maybe Turkey, I don't know, some other issues. I'm sure they'll throw in an African country. They'll probably go after Nicaragua or maybe talk about Cuba. Who knows? Countries that the US is comfortable opposing, those countries, their records on press freedom will be raised. And it's not that they're totally off. It's not that they won't be talking about real problems and obstacles for freedom of the press in those countries. It's just that this will be a dodge from addressing the record of countries in Europe who are allies and the United States. And yeah, so and I'll also say this, that Ryan Grimm now knows this quote, and I guarantee you that the next time that this comes up, not only is he going to be prepared to reply and answer back what he was able to poke a hole in Matthew Miller's statement about the computer crime offense, and he's going to be ready with Matthew Miller's own comment. I think it's very plain that somebody should ask him, since he's defended the Assange prosecution. And also, now's a good time. The State Department is the one that put the assurances forward. So go and ask him why his Justice Department had this position, and then now professionally at the State Department, he is forced to take this other position. Well, what changed? What's different? Has he personally changed his view, or is this just, what he has to do to cut a paycheck from the State Department? Then, it's pretty obvious that Matthew Miller has turned into a kind of soulless individual. Some of us out here can sleep at night knowing that we haven't done the sort of thing or defended the sort of things that Matthew Miller does day in and day out. I would think that if there was anything intact in Matthew Miller as a human being, that once he leaves the State Department, he might suffer from some kind of like PTSD. Hopefully he has some kind of moral injury. If there's any humanity left, he would be confessing his sins to someone later on after his time in the Biden White House. But these people just, they become indoctrinated to a kind of culture and life within Washington, D.C. And so I don't know that there will be that kind of self-awareness. But there it is right out there in the open. The department in the United States government that submits the assurances, the guy who's the spokesperson for it, was principally opposed to the Justice Department indicting Julian Assange when Donald Trump was president. And now Joe Biden's in office, and that's their guy. That's the guy that leads his team. That's Team Democrat. And Team Democrat can justify prosecuting Julian Assange, and Donald Trump can't. So isn't that U.S. politics for you? That's really how it works. That's how it gets boiled down. The people on one team can usually justify any kind of atrocious act. And then when their guy isn't in the White House, they're opposed to those actions. That's been observed under Barack Obama. It's observed under President Donald Trump. It's observed under Joe Biden. It's observed under President George W. Bush, if you want to go back 20 years. And we should. We absolutely should, because this kind of sociopathy, it truly escalated after the 9/11 attacks and what we're dealing here. And the reason why WikiLeaks is so essential, let's end on this note. of recognizing the contribution and why we talk about why do I every time that I'm on this channel am I doing this? Is it just because that's, the way I think I can get attention? I think there are better ways that I could be using this channel. I think there are other stories and topics that I could be covering, other clickbaity topics that I could be discussing. This is important to me because WikiLeaks made information available to us that enhanced our public knowledge, and they pioneered a system in which leaks could be provided to journalists. And then they also said that those documents that they publish, we should all have access to that information. The citizens of the world should be able to read it. Don't keep it in some library or archive in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And don't publish highly redacted documents that people cannot decipher. And show everyone these documents. Let's let scholars, historians, let's let people who are involved in activism and people who are involved in efforts to bring people to justice for human rights violations, war crimes, etc. Let's let all of this information about what governments do be out in the open so that people can make the world a bit of a better place, a little bit of a more just and humane world. And instead, what happened is the U.S. government saw that as a threat. The people who are in U.S. intelligence agencies, in the U.S. military panicked. You can hear people who were right there in the U.S. military speak from what they observed and what they were subjected to when they were trained. They're told WikiLeaks is a threat to the United States. Don't go to this website. Don't download anything from it. Don't visit it. Don't read it. Even if you have this material on your own computer and you could read it at any moment, or even if knowing what material was out there would make you a better military officer or an intelligence analyst, don't read it. Be ignorant. Don't know what WikiLeaks is trying to tell people around the world. And that's because they had to maintain this farce that WikiLeaks was a threat to the United States. And then it really and truly, it's not a threat to the United States unless the U.S. makes it out to be one. The U.S. chooses its enemies. It chooses the people who it wants to fight. It props up those enemies because those are the enemies that the United States as an empire wants to fight. So any of these people could be acceptable. These countries that we talk about as adversaries, they could be part of the globe, and they don't have to be persona non grata. They don't have to be pariah states. Some of them maybe do deserve to be challenged because of their human rights abuses and the way that they behave. But look, for everything that those countries do that we talk about, we can find actions that the United States does that they don't want us to see as equivalent, but are actually abhorrent and abominable acts that we have to stand up and challenge. And so I thank you for tuning in. I'm coming to the end of this broadcast. I see some of you are taking off too. And you can tell that this I'm winding down. I appreciate all of you for being here. I'm going to put this up here because you've been a very good supporter, Lady Alex. Thank you for tuning in. I know you as well, bungled and botched. So I'm glad you were here. And Allie, thank you for being here. And I'm glad that all of you were able to tune in and get this news. The date on the calendar that we'll next be talking about a major development in Julian Assange's case will be that hearing on May 20th, unless we get some charges dropped, unless we see the withdrawal of the case, or we see Australia and the US come up with some kind of a plea agreement with Assange. Until then, you can go here and you can sign up to the newsletter. You can go here if you're inclined to support independent journalism on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, as well as whistleblowing, press freedom, and government secrecy. And then I've got a book. The book it's called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. This is a political case. The State Department submitting those assurances made a political choice. It did not have to defend and continue to pursue extradition. It could have ended the case. It could have heeded Australia's call to free Julian Assange and return an Australian citizen to Australia. But it wants this. It wants to put Julian Assange on trial, no matter how many of us are fighting against it. And so here they go. Just as they won't have a ceasefire in Gaza, just as there won't be peace there in the Middle East, there won't be freedom for Julian Assange at this moment. So what do? We have to keep fighting. We have to keep challenging and keep struggling because we know that this is unacceptable. We know what is just and fair. And so we keep fighting for that justice. Have a good evening, and I'll talk to you all later.